Good day, everyone, and welcome to this PhD defense. My name is Justin Hogwarth. My name is Justin Hogwarth, and I will be the moderator of this session. The doors will have now been closed and locked. It is not permitted for any person to leave or enter the auditorium now until the planned break. I will remind everyone that this session will be live streamed over our Facebook profile. On behalf of the PhD school at Ilisimatusarfik and the Institute of Society, Economics and Journalism, I welcome you all to the PhD defense of Mitdlarak Lennert. The title of Mitdlarak thesis is The Administrative Context of the Greenland Primary and Lower Secondary School System, a Governance System Misaligned with Learning. Welcome to our esteemed evaluation committee. The committee chair, Associate Professor Kevin Perry, PhD, Department of Society, Economics and Journalism, Ilisimatusarfik, and also the chair of the committee. And on the screen over there, welcome Professor Diane Hersberg, PhD, Institute of Social and Economic Research, University of Alaska Anchorage, and Director Michael Quinn Patton, PhD, Utilization Focused Evaluation, St. Paul, Minnesota. And please, Diane and Michael, just want to remind that you mute your microphones when you are not speaking. And welcome to the Mitdlarak supervisors, Associate Professor Maria Krien, PhD, Department of Social Sciences, Ilisimatusarfik, and Associate Professor Stephen Arnfjord, PhD, Department of Social Sciences, Ilisimatusarfik. And of course, a warm welcome to Mitdlarak Lennert. We are gathered here today because after a rigorous evaluation, the PhD Evaluation Committee has accepted Mitdlarak's thesis for public defense. In other words, Mitdlarak's PhD thesis meets the international requirements for her thesis to be publicly scrutinized. So, for the coming hours, I will be, as said, the moderator and leader of the defense and make sure that the defense takes place according to our guidelines. The process is as follows. Following my introduction, Mitdlarak will give a public lecture about her work. She has a maximum of 1 hour. Following Mitdlarak's presentation, there will be a 20-minute break. Next, the evaluation committee examines Mitdlarak through a critical dialogue. Each opponent has a minimum of 20 and a maximum of 30 minutes to ask questions. The examination sequence is as follows: Professor Diane Hersberg, Director Michael Quinn Patton, and then Associate Professor Kevin Perry. After the committee is finished, persons present in the auditorium can ask Mitdlarak relevant questions about her thesis or presentation. However, all questions must go through me. Anyone wishing to ask Mitdlarak questions must inform me during the break and present your question. Then you will be given the opportunity to present your questions after the committee's examination is said. Then, immediately after the defense, the assessment committee retires to deliberate and make their final assessment. After their assessment, the committee chairman announces their final decisions publicly in the auditorium. A positive evaluation means that the PhD evaluation, the committee recommends to the Academic Council of Ilisimatusarfik that Mitdlarak receives the PhD degree. And finally, 2 important reminders. This is an examination, and therefore you are kindly asked not to applaud after Mitdlarak's presentation. And please turn off mobile phones or any other devices that might disturb the examination. And I think this what I have to say now. So I will ask you, Mitdlarak, are you ready? And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the introduction. Welcome to everyone, to those of you physically in the room and to those watching the event online. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your interest and time. I have really been looking forward to this day where I have the opportunity to talk about a very exciting and important topic, namely the administration and evaluation of the Greenland public school. 10 years ago, I sat in this room and was introduced to academia. It is a little surreal to be standing here today and defending my dissertation. I had been told that this will be the only time where everyone reads my dissertation from start to finish as thoroughly as the assessment committee has done, so I look forward to discussing my dissertation with you. During the next hour, we're going to cover a lot of material. The dissertation itself is over 250 pages long, and I won't have time to cover everything in detail. In my presentation, I will start by giving a background and introduction to the issue. I will then review what theories and methods I have used. Then I will present the 4 articles and conclusions in which the dissertation is based. In addition to the analysis and conclusions in my dissertation, I have chosen to discuss 2 themes with great impact to the quality of education. I will end my presentation with a discussion on how my findings can be used to change school practice. I will jump right into the significance of my problem area and the puzzle that brought me to this research and to pursue a PhD. In many ways, the motivation behind this dissertation has been shaped from my own experiences in the Greenland education system and led to a desire to change the education system for the better. When I started, I had many questions about the education system that I'm a product of, a system that has had an impressive growth. I want to point out that the formal education system is still very young. Ever since the first missionaries in the 1720s began to teach Greenlanders to read, teaching has been taking place in Greenland. It was only after the Great Greenland Commission of 1948 submitted their report in 1950 and the school area was transferred from the church to the state that Danish got a wider place in the school. During the colony period, formal education only came into play when one could not be educated or was poor at the traditional professions. From around 1950, the development really took off with a number of political decisions. And the business structure transformed from having no or little demands on formal education to formal education becoming a prerequisite to advance it in the job market. Much hope is pinned on education to yield enhanced productivity, economic growth, social development, and poverty reduction. However, for education to deliver on these expectations, it must be of sufficient quantity and quality to lead to meaningful learning among young people. In Greenland, the school system is central to the debate about how to develop the nation, and is often pointed out as the root cause to many problems in society. The challenge becomes the gap between the school and further education, as too many finish grade 10 without having the qualifications to continue directly in the education system. The problem is then how to raise quality of the school in order to best prepare the students for what comes next. Ever since the Home Rule Act assumed the responsibility of the education sector, the saying has been that the 3 most important issues have been education, education, and education. It illustrates how education politically has been agenda setting and seen as the most central issue in terms of developing the Greenlandic society. The question is why the political and administrative system have not and does not keep a better eye out on how the education system is running. While there are potentially many explanations, this dissertation explores how the structure of the administrative and governance systems are affected by context. to discuss aspects that policymakers and implementers of reform will need to consider if reform efforts are to successfully improve learning outcomes and ultimately the education level of the Greenlandic population. The analysis was guided by 4 sub-questions, which are addressed in the scientific articles presented in the dissertation. My research questions are ultimately about how the governance and accountability systems that are in place works to ensure that the goal in the first slide, whether Ilisimatusarfik, the Silak or Nuuk, gets an education that meets the requirements set by law. Throughout this dissertation, I have asked critical questions about why we do things we do, what the purpose is, and whether what we do is the best way to achieve our goals. So who has the main responsibility for maintaining or improving the quality of education? Who is held accountable? And more importantly, how? What happens if what is going on in the classroom doesn't meet the requirements set by law? To answer the research questions, I conducted an embedded case study to provide an in-depth analysis of the governance and management form of complex education system from a Greenlandic perspective. Based on my interest in system-level developments, I chose to conduct qualitative interviews with policymakers, municipal education directors, school boards and teachers, and observe national and local meetings and events. The articles approach the research area from different angles, and each article feeds into discussions related to one or more topics. The approach is qualitative interpretive, as the aim is to understand how actors try to navigate in these systems, how they understand key concepts, how they coordinate and adapt them to local contexts. For my inquiry into the issue of how political economy shape accountability mechanisms, I have engaged different bodies of literature with relevance to my topic. I use complexity theory as the overarching concept, thereby framing education system as complex phenomena. I draw on the work by Druid and Galas, who examine governance from a complex adaptive system perspective in order to analyze the complexities of governance systems and their abilities to embrace change and uncertainty according to their structure and capacity. A political economy approach also emphasizes the importance of politics. This perspective opens up relationships between the national and local administrative context, and ultimately how these factors in combination affects the conditions for which policies are to perform under. In the center, I have accountability and evaluation systems, which are the core of my dissertation. I use evaluation theory to discuss a possibility to transform the administrative processes to be more oriented towards development and improvement of practice. I will now transition over to the analysis, main findings, and conclusions. Before I go into the analysis, I will present the 4 scientific articles. Article 1 on coherence showed the importance of cooperation and coordination between governance levels in terms of implementing and monitoring education reforms. Article 2 on e-learning on iPads showed that there is no quick technical fix to raise the quality of education, as the context matter in how iPads can be used. Article 3 digs into the context of a young nation, where there is a need to build a nation by speaking Greenlandic in the classroom, and how this is important, how the level of education can be raised. Article 4 is yet another example. Here, performance management is a script on how education systems should be redirected in accordance to new public management. However, as policy and evaluation instruments are not used as intended, it again does not trigger the mechanisms that lead to better education. In the following slides, I will go through the main findings of the articles. I have broken down my summary and discussion of the main findings into following themes. The findings presented here are chosen with a focus on extracting the most interesting and critical results. The analysis points toward an accountability system and practice that is not compatible with the legislation. While the school legislation is child and learning centered, the administrative processes are in contrast heavily focused on simple models, day-to-day operation, and not on improvement of the education system. It is time to question the way things are done, what was the purpose, and what did we end up with. Before I go into details of my findings, I want to highlight the context of Greenland and how it impacts the conditions of quality of education. Quality in school is basically about creating good learning environments. And since we have such different schools along the coast, the prerequisites for creating these are very different. We have a sparse population confined to small settlements, a big geographic area with resulting substantial use of resources. There's a great teacher shortage, both in terms of numbers and skills in terms of the subject teachers are qualified to teach. The fact is that the teacher training college cannot produce enough graduates compared to the rates the teachers are retiring. There's a geographical challenge in terms of attracting and retaining qualified teachers in small towns and settlements, as it is not possible to commute. This means that in many places it is not possible to provide the level of education, the level of quality teaching that is required by law, which I will return to. Quality in the school therefore depends on many factors that the individual municipalities and schools do not always have control over. We can take an example of a settlement school where you have an old building and a permanent shortage of trained teachers. Can and should one expect the same level of quality as an urban school, given the fundamentally different preconditions? There's no doubt that the education system as a whole and the school area are facing complex problems, and that there are many things that come into play when it comes to management. Today, the modern school system has just about 8,000 students in 80 schools along the Greenland coast. There are schools with over 400 students and schools with only 3 to 5 students. Yet they're all governed under the same law and same expectations to deliver a quality education. These 80 schools, with varying regional challenges and needs, are governed by school principals, municipalities, and the Ministry of Education. There's a saying, you have to know where you are and where you're going in order to get there. So I asked, if the national government is to make policies, what type of data inform the other levels of government, and how are education policies translated into practice? Are policies based on and addressing the practical realities in the classroom and schools, or the specific regional challenges in the municipality? The findings illustrate what seems to be a historical lack of coordination in connection with the implementation processes in respect to education reform, where there has been no tradition of extensive cooperation and planning across municipalities and central government, or a solid tradition for monitoring and conducting visualization-focused evaluations. One thing is the coordination and cooperation between governance levels, institutions, and key stakeholders to secure a coherent framework and infrastructure. Another is implementing the wanted change in the classroom and working towards the desired outcomes. This case is a great example to illustrate the lack of coherence between the different levels of administration. The iPad project has its origin in the 2012 Greenland Sustainability Project. The iPad project has since grown to a national project with participation from all 5 municipalities in Greenland. Several years after the beginning stages of the iPad project, the conclusion is that the education system has not been ready to take the full advantage of the potential of technology. The interesting thing here is that due to a lack of cooperation and coherence on strategies across the different stakeholders, it has been difficult to create the wanted impact on classroom practice. The paradox lies in the ambitions of a country wanting to introduce a one-to-one iPad learning for all students, but having no plans for curriculum or the professional development of teachers in advance. The national, regional, and local levels of the governance system all have supervisory obligations. These obligations, however, are not specified in content nor frequency. To evaluate, objectives must be formulated. So what types of objectives are being set? What is being monitored and for what purpose? Is it to get information on how schools can improve and set new goals? Or is it, quote, a piece of work to be done? There's a lot of power in what is measured and what definition of performance is adopted. The quotes tell a story about an accountability system that monitors information that tells us something is not right, like if scheduled teaching hours were carried out as planned, or how much teachers were absent. But the information does not tell us why something isn't right, or how to make changes for the better. One of the most interesting findings of my study is that it is not just the questions whether education systems and learning outcomes are monitored. It is as much about what type of information is gathered and how it is used to improve practice. A lot of resources and time are spent on standardized testing, quality reports, and supervisions in order to take the temperature of the quality of education. But what happens after? Follow-up seems like common sense, but it is not common practice. Evaluation and monitoring results should support learning and show if the right path has been chosen. But it seems like we never reach the question of then what? Municipalities have to evaluate themselves, but they don't have the capacity, resources, or incentives to do so. A paradox is also that the central government has a supervisory obligation, but no power to demand change, as the schools are municipal responsibility. So what is a quality school? What does it take? How do we get there? This picture was taken in a school and shows what a good school should be like from the perspective of students. According to students, a good school is where there is respect, friendship, good teachers, interesting assignments, and a place where you have fun and learn. I want to highlight and contrast some of the key words from the poster with how quality is defined and measured from a policy perspective. Over the past years, I have interviewed policymakers, system leaders, and teachers about quality and evaluation. Basically, system leaders of education all agree on the purpose of education and what a good school and education should do. It is about creating good learning environments with the child in the center. When asked about quality, they all describe the concept as something complex and involving multiple actors and factors. Quality is a lot of things. So how is it defined, and how do those responsible make sure it happens? Today, it is not clear what quality is, when the results are good and when they are bad. Apart from the centrally set curriculum learning outcomes, no national standard or objective is set on the level of quality of the standardized test or final examinations. There is therefore a lack of clarity in what is meant by the quality of the school, how to raise this, and by what means. The fact that some schools are doing better points towards the conclusion that politics, students, and context matter. The legislation is flexible enough in terms of having delegated enough decision-making power to municipal and local school boards. However, in order to take advantage of the flexibility, there are prerequisites such as competent leadership and motivated and capable teachers that need to be in place. In contexts where the prerequisites are not present, the flexibility possibly does more damage than good. I will later on return to the question on how the home environment plays a role in quality schooling. I think we can all agree that the purpose of going to school is learning. In terms of ensuring learning and quality, standardized testing in grades 3 and 7 was introduced in 2006. In my research, I analyzed the purpose of the evaluation tool in policy documents, how system leaders and teachers see the purpose, and how the information is used to see whether the purpose in practice was the same as in the policy. I found that key components of policy and evaluation tools are interpreted differently across governance levels. The further you go away from the classroom, the evaluation instruments change in nature and purpose, away from having learning and the child in the center, and instead simple indicators prevail where kids are simplified into numbers and tables. All administrative layers around the school are very concerned about whether the teachers have taught, the number of hours they were supposed to, and whether the children have been in school, but apparently not on what is going on inside the classroom. The purpose of the supervision that becomes to see whether schools comply with legislation and not on improvement and development. With the type of data that is collected, the supervision is reduced to focus on input measures that have very little correlation with the quality of teaching or learning. This results in a practice where action is taken without shedding light on the reasons for the challenges facing the school. A schooling without learning is a terrible waste of time, valuable resources, human potential, and not to mention a violation of children's rights. The key constraint in the system therefore becomes the fact that accountability systems are more concerned with process compliance due to the typical management accountability than it is with student learning. In my dissertation, I have focused on the system and what is going on outside the classroom, like structural conditions in the form of legislation, evaluation, supervision, and the cooperation between the various administrative wings. I will therefore, from a political science perspective, discuss other things that affect the quality of education, namely the conditions and challenges inside the classroom. So what does research show what the effects are on school readiness and learning? First of all, school readiness is a broad concept. But overall, the term school readiness reflects a child's ability to succeed both academically and socially in a school environment. It requires physical well-being, an appropriate motor development, emotional health, a positive approach to new experiences, age-appropriate social knowledge and competence, language skills, and general knowledge and cognitive skills. Research shows the factors that influence school readiness include poverty, preschool attendance, parenting behaviors, parent education, maternal depression, prenatal exposure to tobacco, and low birth weight. These factors are factors that affect school readiness after birth. Research also shows that prenatal drug and substance abuse has an effect on intelligence and school readiness. The complexity of these factors show that intervention should start early and should be done across different policy sectors, not only education. It is a systems problem. Research shows that poor children start school at a disadvantage in terms of their early skills, behavior, and health. Children born into poverty face many challenges. Exposure to poverty comes in different forms, and children may also transition into or out of poverty. Children from low-income homes often lag behind their peers from high-income homes in math and reading, while simultaneously display more behavioral difficulties than their high-income peers. A couple of years ago, the Greenland Economic Council analyzed the connection between grade 3 and 7 test results of grades in the final exams. The analysis shows that those students who do poorly in the early stages of primary school are very likely to get an exam that is not sufficient for them to continue in the education system. This shows that if you start school from a disadvantage, you will have a hard time catching up to your peers. Apart from material poverty, there's in the literature also the concepts of inequality of opportunity and social inheritance when it comes to school readiness. The first concept describes the phenomena that although there is formally equal access to school and education, parents' educational background is very crucial for their children's chances in relation to education. Social inheritance is a concept based on the hypothesis that a person inherits knowledge, attitudes, and personality traits from their parents through their upbringing. Social heritage is a very broad concept, and researchers do not yet exactly know how the mechanisms work. The broadness of the concept also challenges how social inheritance is measured. Usually indicators such as life income, education level, and job positions are used, but these indicators do not tell the whole story, as some vulnerable children break with their negative social heritage and become well-functioning adults. Conversely, children from affluent homes can also end up in problems that children with negative social heritage struggle with. It is therefore not possible to point to a clear connection between certain conditions of growing up and a subsequent better good life as an adult. There's a strong consensus among researchers that the education system in its current form does not break the cycle of disadvantage. At worst, it can increase inequality. Another big factor for school readiness is the quality of daycare institutions and the transition from daycare to school. Mads Meyer, professor of sociology at DPU in Denmark, believes that daycare institutions can provide children from vulnerable homes with the social and psychological skills that are important for good development, but which the parents cannot provide. Daycare institutions can thus, optimally speaking, compensate for parents' mental or physical absence, and thus contribute to the negative social heritage being broken. In Greenland and the rest of the Nordic region, children officially have better conditions for being able to break the negative social heritage. Greenland has a welfare system, which means, among other things, that all children can go to daycare, primary school, and take a youth education. While there are no studies in Greenland, according to several studies, Denmark is no better at breaking the negative social heritage than other OECD countries. This indicates that equal access does not level out different starting points and does not create equality. A report regarding the daycare institution in Greenland was recently published. The report shows that the child's basic needs, such as food, clothes, and a place to be during the day, are covered. However, the lack of educators and the rapid replacement of staff, as well as to some extent the predominance of untrained staff in the daycare institution, means that the child's need for development and learning is set aside. And this lack of stimuli has a domino effect that reaches all the way up to adulthood. An interesting fact is that a report pointing at the same challenges was published in 2017. 4 years after, we are still talking about the same issues. But what has been done? So what does it look like in Greenland? Does poverty mean the same for school readiness? Currently, there's no research or documentation on how poverty affects school readiness in Greenland. On paper, we have equal access to education, but in practice, there are a number of structural factors that mean that students do not have the same starting point when they start school, depending on which municipality they live in and their social background. A poorly functioning school with a lack of quality in teaching is detrimental to all students, and in particular to students with a weak starting point. The school and the legislation as we know it today presuppose that the children are ready for learning when they come to school, which I will get back to. A teacher is generally essential to his class and his school, but in a settlement, the teacher is a very central factor in success or failure. There are large differences in income in Greenland. Statistics show that there's a significant difference between the poorest proportion of the population and the rest of the Greenlandic society. In addition to the structural factors, the background and prerequisites of students of course play a role in school readiness. My point in this slide is that material poverty does not tell the whole picture. There are a lot of factors that go into the issue. The surroundings of students have great impact for their attitudes and readiness for school. Setting aside material poverty for a bit, I want to spend a few minutes on attitudes towards education. The question here is whether education is seen as important by the family and community. The family plays an important role in young people's choice or opt-out of education. If education is seen as important by the parents and they show up for parent-teacher meetings and make sure that the children get enough sleep and food, children may have an easier time to see a purpose in going to school. Another factor is the connection to place and family. If you cannot see yourself in school, then it is hard to belong. Many young people have to move away from their families and communities in order to finish school and continue in the education system. Some have to move already when they're only 14 years old and live in student residential homes to finish the last years of primary and lower secondary school. The quality of the residential homes have been discussed for many years. The physical and pedagogical framework around the students have been criticized extensively, and as a result, a new executive order setting up minimum requirements is underway. The challenge is twofold, as even if young people move away from what they know and get an education, the fact is that when they are done, there are not always jobs for them when they get back home. I also want to stress that the level of education reflects the business structure in the country. Not all young people who do not have an education is due to a poor primary school or lack of school readiness due to poverty or other challenges in the home. For many young people, it is an active choice. A choice to pursue traditional education or to follow in the footsteps of their families and choose a livelihood of fisheries and hunting. Fisheries is, after all, the main export of Greenland. Turning back into poverty and different starting points. Looking specifically at the school management system in Greenland, there are no national preventive or systematic initiatives in terms of leveling out the different starting points. The system just assumes that the children are school ready. There's currently no overview of the issue of how poverty affects school readiness, so more research and information are needed. For example, no official statistics are kept on notifications from schools to municipalities regarding kids that are at risk. However, these notifications also do not tell the whole story. For example, there are no notifications if parents do not show up for meetings or show an interest in the child's schooling. Factors, as I have discussed earlier, that have a great impact. School meals are offered in some municipalities and schools, but not all. Some municipalities have not been able to afford school meals. In practice, the municipality can apply for funding if the municipality itself can contribute to half of the costs. Right now, schools are not designed for school meals. Few schools have canteens and must therefore use classrooms and school resources to buy food from outside the school. There are also no considerations about how and what to eat. Many students go across the street and buy potato chips and sodas, often at the request of parents and without the school intervening. In some municipalities and schools, there's an initiative called family classes. The purpose of family classes is for parents, the child, and the child's teacher to work together in different ways toward the child getting better learning conditions and becoming a happier school child. In some municipalities and schools, there are also social workers. The initiative is part of a strategy for working with vulnerable children and their families. When looking back at the transition from daycare to schools, the good transition from daycare to school calls for good cooperation between many actors. Right now, school readiness is measured solely on the basis of students' academic abilities. A lot of information is lost in the transition in terms of the social background of the kids. There's therefore a need for qualified knowledge of the factors that affect the school's ability to lift the students academically. A screening tool has been developed by the Agency of Education to assess the states of development among 3 and 5-year-olds. However, the extent and use of the tool in different municipalities is not known, as the data is not gathered in a central database. Imagine the knowledge that could be gained if this knowledge was centralized and used and could inform policies on school readiness. The initiatives can overall be seen as practical efforts and not as targeted systematic efforts. There's therefore a great need from a policy level to start the discussion on school readiness and what can be done to a greater extent to break the cycle of disadvantage. When we know that the student's background is important for their school readiness, then we must, from a policy and school level, take this into account when we enroll them to school. Discussions on how to create more equal conditions in the school and what a good school start is should also be initiated. In Greenland, we celebrate both enrollment and the first day of school with kaffemik. Kaffemik is a tradition where you invite friends and family to coffee, food, and cakes. Although this is a nice tradition, it also maintains an image that children are equally advanced in their development as when they are at this point in their lives, when in fact they aren't. The responsibility for own learning may be manageable for some children, but may be difficult for children with challenges at home. Possibilities of transition courses where children are taught by teachers, two teacher schemes, homework cafes, and other initiatives that may help level out the different starting points should be discussed. We should also start discussing the possibility to a higher degree to enable children to start school at different times according to their starting points. In addition to these suggestions, evaluations of daycare institutions and school staff should be carried out on a regular basis so that more attention is paid to whether the children are stimulated enough in daycare institutions. Transitioning into the second theme, I will first give an overview of what the research says about factors that affect the classroom environment. A large amount of the child's time is spent sitting in a school classroom. How can we set up classroom to the best of our ability with the physical, structural, and psychological support necessary to provide our students with an idyllic learning environment? Creating a cooperative learning environment has both a positive social and educational impact on each participating student. Successful learning environments also require that learning objectives be relevant to students and their lives outside the classroom. Research findings suggest that the physical environment can have such an impact on students that it could affect a student's academic progress by as much as 25%. Colors, classroom organization, cleanliness, sufficient supplies, and bright lights can enhance learning experiences and boost student achievements. Alternatively, crowded and disorganized rooms often result in lower student achievement and a poorer student disposition. The psychological classroom environment is just as important as the physical one. Without the proper support, students risk study anxiety, poor performance, and negative behavior. A supportive and engaging learning environment is therefore a critical ingredient in the recipe for student success. Without proper nutritive support, students lack the ability to properly focus on coursework and retain information. Bullying negatively affects school well-being. A recent study in Greenland shows that up to 50% in a cohort experience being bullied. This number is very high and demands a critical look at how bullying is defined and experienced by children. I will begin my discussion with a systems perspective on conditions and factors that affect the classroom environment and student-teacher relationship in Greenland. The conditions of school buildings in Greenland are very varied. Some school buildings are new, while others are worn-out buildings with small classrooms. Today, there can be a maximum of 26 students in a classroom. While on average there are 14 students in a classroom in a town and 7 in settlements, these numbers are often not determined from an educational point of view. If all the students are school ready, it may work out fine. But if a number of students aren't ready for learning, it can have major implications for the classroom environment. An indicator that there are students that aren't school ready and cannot be accommodated in regular classes can be found in the number of special classes. Around 10% of all students in Greenland are in special classes, and almost 1 in 5 of all special class students are due to problems with behavior and well-being. Another statistic that sticks out is that 8 out of 10 students with behavioral and well-being challenges are boys. The training of teachers is of course a major precondition that affects the classroom environment. I will discuss this issue in the next slide. Based on the Greenland structural and socioeconomic context, how are teachers prepared to tackle the challenges? According to Ilisimatusarfik, a Danish researcher, the teacher's interpersonal knowledge and skills is the primary factor that determines whether children's time in school is either a waste of time or is the foundation that they, after finishing school, will and can contribute to the outside world with their unique strengths. The teacher's interpersonal knowledge and skills is the competence to enter into positive relations with each student and the class as a whole, which promotes the students' well-being and their professional, social, and personal development. This competence affects the well-being of children, their academic performance, ability to self-regulate, how well challenged children cope, their future, and not least the relationships in the classroom. Last year, IMAC, the Greenland Teachers Union, published a study that every fourth teacher experiences stress symptoms. An evaluation of the Teachers Training College in 2016 showed that teacher students do not gain sufficient skills to handle the many different tasks that accompany the profession as a teacher in school. Many graduates have not been adequately equipped for tasks such as managing a class, teaching different types of students, differentiating learning, working with effective teaching principles, learning objectives, action plans and evaluation, as well as participating in school-home collaboration. In addition, the newly graduated teachers often come with combinations of main subjects that do not correspond to the needs of the schools. As a result of the evaluation, all teacher students must now go through a course that deals with students' challenges. The effect of this is still unknown, as the cohorts who have gone through this training still haven't graduated. I will end this slide with asking, does a teacher education guarantee quality if the main subject the teachers are trained in is not utilized in the school's subject distribution and scheduling? The student perspective and children's lack of real opportunities for participation and bargaining power in areas that are vital to both their present and future lives as fellow citizens is a very important discussion that is often overlooked. The children's experiences from school are crucial to how they succeed in the education system as young people. We need to know how children learn, but we should also be interested in what children think of what they learn, because that has an influence on their relation to learning. A 2019 pilot study shows the current situation in Greenlandic schools, and the research suggests that we must take students' experiences of the teaching seriously. The difficulties here are that we do not know enough about how students experience the teaching and what basic school experiences they get. The study finds that the children have interesting insights into what learning effects can be achieved from the teaching. Schooling is not the same as learning. When looking at the legislation, the student is responsible for the fulfillment of learning outcomes, but are not involved in the process of describing how and what they are to learn. And this lack of co-determination says something about the relationship. I will return to this paradox where the children have a responsibility of their own learning, but no say in terms of the conditions for which they are to learn under in the next slide. Today, in this physical and virtual room, we have officials, policymakers, politicians, researchers, and parents. We are the adults. What is it that we adults need to do and are responsible for if our children are not learning or thriving? A lot of responsibility is placed on children by the legal framework. They have the responsibility of their own learning. But if the framework around a good learning environment is not present, whose responsibility is it then? Let us, the adults, make sure that the children have the best conditions to carry out that responsibility by providing a primary school that lives up to the expectations set in the legislation. There are a lot of factors that affect whether a student thrives and learns in school. For who is actually responsible for Beningok or Kalungok getting an A or an E at the final exam? Are the students alone responsible? Or should the responsibility also be placed with the parents or the teacher who has completed a teaching that makes sense for the student? Or if the result is an E in the subject English, that the responsibility also lies with the headmaster who has assigned the teaching of English to a teacher who is not trained to teach the subject? Or is the responsibility for the student's grade E further up in the system, where the municipality has allocated too little teaching time during the years the student has had English. There is a paradox in the fact that in a legal text, the student is given a great responsibility, which is then a goal for an evaluation through tests and final exams. While at the same time, there are many layers of stakeholders who have shares in the school, but in the end is not held accountable for the student's outcome from the school. A discussion grounded in what the purpose should be behind the way things are done is highly necessary to get away from a culture of process compliance and to having learning and the children in the center. What should be the minimum level of quality teaching that we as a society accept? In the beginning of my presentation, I said that politicians have called out for education since the 80s. One thing is to politically call out for education. Another is to actually prioritize the sector in terms of both finances and taking accountability. It is disrespectful to call out for education when the education system does not provide a school that lives up to the expectations set in legislation. Right now, the teaching process can be described as having a nationally set learning outcome, an activity set by the teacher, and then there's a student learning outcome. Students should to a greater extent be involved in influencing the organizations of teaching. I'm not saying that children should make the decisions, but they have a right to be heard about their opinions. In the overall process, we should be more interested if students feel that they are learning something from the activities that are linked to their learning outcomes. The learning objectives have not been changed since they were formulated in 2002. These lack feedback from teachers and students. How well do they work? To ensure that the learning objectives are not only reformulated on the basis of what teachers have experienced, it is very important to also involve the students in this process. Right now, there's a view that the children themselves are not able to assess what they're learning. This view should also be reconsidered. Throughout this dissertation, my objective has been to discuss whether systems, structures, processes, tools, and practice are aligned for learning and development or process compliance. The dissertation questions the accountability system that is in place in the Greenland school system. My conclusions point to a need to critically look at the purpose behind why accountability mechanisms are structured the way they are, as policy and evaluation instruments are not used as intended to develop the school system. Part of the explanation could be that the Greenlandic school education system is built on governance and administration structures that does not always make sense, as they require a steady pool of skilled labor, and due to a vast geography, high turnover rates often results in capacity challenges. So it becomes not just a question whether policy fits context, but how the institutions where policy is to be implemented fits in with the local workforce. If the education system is to live up to its purpose and the children's right to learn, it is necessary to restructure the system. While the school legislation is child and learning centered, the administrative processes are in contrast heavily focused on simple models, day-to-day operation, and not on improvement of the school system. A lot of time and resources are spent collecting information that tells us something is not right. However, this information does not explain why. This, combined with no systematic follow-up in relation to the information collected, results in what can be described as half a performance management system. In other words, an expensive and time-consuming practice and system that adds little value in terms of school development and improvement. While capacity challenges, both in terms of attaining teachers and administrative personnel in small places, takes time and are more difficult to come about, the good news is that it is possible to change accountability structures. The question is whether there is political will to do so. Throughout this defense, I have critiqued the administrative system and the way the school system is being monitored. I have argued that the current governance structure in place and the policy instrument do not work to systematically improve and develop status quo in the school system. In the theme of this dissertation, one can ask whether a better evaluation, accountability, and monitoring scheme can face the challenges. And what should it look like? The school system is a complex system with many actors and agendas. Creating a system that works and develops the status quo is therefore a complex problem, meaning there's no easy fix or one solution that fits all. I will start this discussion with determining what should happen where, as my analysis points to several points where some simple issues are moved up to the complex and complicated zones, partly due to politics and disagreement. Paper 1 showed a lack of coherence in education goals across administration levels and schools. Paper 2 showed disagreements and discussions as to what extent iPads should be implemented in the school system. Paper 4 showed that evaluation instruments are not being used as intended. This indicates that there is uncertainty and disagreement on roles and responsibilities across the administrative systems. The macro level determines the overall intentions and justifications, the teaching's why, while the teaching's what and how are determined at the meso and partly at the micro level. I think we can all agree that we want development and improvement. However, when it comes to acting and working towards a better school and education system, it involves change. And this is why it gets difficult, as change is almost never popular. There's a great need from a macro and policy perspective to take implementation processes and the different contexts seriously. It is not enough to state beautiful intentions and look the other way when the municipalities and schools can't realize them. In the next slides, I will discuss suggestions to how this can be improved. Systemic challenges require systemic solutions. While policies must make sense and be relevant, I will not be making any recommendations as to which pedagogical content or policies should be pursued. Instead, as I have done throughout this dissertation, I will focus on the processes behind the decisions that shape the school system. The following 6 steps are my suggestions to possible approaches to improve the school system by embedding evaluative thinking into the administrative processes. These steps are covered in more detail in my dissertation. A first step is to establish what is possible within the current framework in terms of legislation, administrative structure, capacity, and finances. Right now, the school is run based on old and sometimes dysfunctional agreements and practices. It is therefore critical to start a discussion on the current way the school system is running. What should be the minimum level of quality teaching that we as a society accept? Is it acceptable that we have schools with no qualified teachers? This challenge sets up a lesser of two evils decision. Do you stay home with the untrained teacher, or do you leave home to seek out a school with good teachers? Another solution could be to increase and develop the level of access to distance learning. The focus of step 2 is on capacity building around the evaluation and accountability practices. The school system is affected by many factors, many sectors that need capacity building. In order to do something about the systemic challenges of the education system, my suggestions are twofold. There's a great need for capacity development in order to build a unified front of committed and capable leaders to drive the change forward and to take responsibility. The ability to evaluate on both pedagogical and strategic goals needs major capacity building. The current evaluation practice is ad hoc and not a natural part of the processes. It should be clarified how policy and evaluation instruments are intended to be used, and practitioners should be properly trained on how to use them. In step 3, based on what is possible, a joint vision and strategy should be formulated to create coherence across the administrative levels of the school system. The formulation of a strategy and a vision for the school system should be done in cooperation with the key actors in the school system. This strategy should be child and learning centered and state principles that are adaptable to different contexts. The purpose of the strategy is to formulate objectives that drive the wanted change in the school system. The objectives should be incorporated in municipal and school documents and be revisited anytime new initiatives are initiated, and be a natural part of the evaluation process. There is a critical need for discussion on what quality is and how it should be measured. The Mitdlarak legal framework and its executive orders define in a broad sense what is expected. This framework should be further operationalized to define what quality looks like across the different administrative levels and classrooms. This operationalization should be based on principles to make space for the different contexts across the municipalities and schools. Forums for professional discussions where practitioners share and reflect on best practices should be established, both on teaching practice and administrative practice. In step 5, evaluation and value thinking should be a natural part of all processes in the school system. There are a number of accountability mechanisms set in place by the current Mitdlarak framework. These mechanisms, however, are not defined sufficiently, making the evaluation practice largely based on statistics and process compliance. A monitoring and evaluation practice that is the same across all municipalities should be developed. The purpose behind a new evaluation instrument and practice should be development, not solely process compliance or control. The final suggestion is to establish a politically independent National Education Council. The appointed members of the council should have an area of expertise and practical knowledge within following areas: pedagogy, school administration, reform processes, and evaluation. The task and purpose of this council should be to closely track the issues and policies affecting education in Greenland. More should be done to promote a process that develops the education system in order to separate solutions and proposals in a professional and a political process. An education council should in the first instance have the task of raising the level of discussion and laying the foundation for factual debate on content and method. In the political process, more can be done to promote transparency in the processes leading up to proposals and decisions. The professionals and practitioners who have to implement decisions from the political process should know the intention and purpose of the laws and executive orders that they are to work from. With this, I will now end my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the assessment committee, my supervisors, family and friends, colleagues, and not least Ilisimatusarfik for giving me the opportunity for this PhD. I could not have done this without you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mitdlarak. Now we have a 20 minutes break, and as said before, if anyone in the audience has a question for Mitdlarak, you can tell me during the break. Thank you, and see you in 20